Hello, and welcome to Mrs. Rodriguez's ninth grade literature class. Today we're going to speak a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe, a little bit about his history, a little bit about his life. We're also going to talk about his famous story, The Telltale Heart. Additionally, we're going to describe a little bit about the plot diagram and how that can help you pull out important parts and organize parts in a short story. So let's get started. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809. He was known for his macabre stories that are filled with gloom and fear and suspense. He's also considered the father of detective fiction, particularly with The Murders in the Rue Morgue. His story is kind of rung true that this might have been the first detective story ever. His stories are all Gothic fiction genre, and Edgar Allan Poe struggled as a writer and as a poet. While he did have bouts of short-lived successes, he mostly lived penniless. He lived surrounded by poverty, and unfortunately he was also an alcoholic. And at the time of his death, which occurred surrounding mysterious events, ironically it's still a mystery today, and one of the controversies with how he died and what exactly happened to him. He was found in a tavern, and a few days later died in the hospital in a state of delirium. So let's move on and watch this video on Edgar Allan Poe and learn a little bit more about him.
Edgar Allan Poe was a master of the macabre. He wrote horror, he wrote poetry, criticism, fiction, mystery. He was a master of suspense.
Edgar Allan Poe, called by many the father of the detective story, was born on January 19, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts.
When Poe was 2 years old, his mother passed away, and his father had already abandoned the family. He was taken in as a foster child by the Allan family.
He was writing poetry from about the time that he was 13. He kept writing all the time. He worked very, very hard at his writing and wrote constantly.
In 1826, Poe enrolled at the University of Virginia. He went into debt, he gambled to try to pay off those debts, and found himself in even greater debt, and ultimately had to withdraw from the university. In 1830, Poe enrolled at West Point.
After West Point, Poe turned to writing full-time and lived in a number of East Coast cities before settling down in Richmond, Virginia.
Edgar Allan Poe secretly married his 13-year-old cousin, and then in 1836 publicly married her in a more open ceremony.
He loved her very, very much. They lived together always until, alas, she died of tuberculosis when she was, I guess, around 20.
Poe's primary occupation as a writer was as a literary critic. He worked at several newspapers and literary magazines, and he had quite a reputation for being a harsh critic. One of his editors called him the Tomahawk Man. During his lifetime, he barely made a living from his writing.
Poe published some of his most famous short stories in his 1840 collection, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque.
He wrote some of his stories using the first person and talking about the use of opium, so people assumed that he dabbled in drugs. The stories were so creepy, they were ghost stories taken to such a brilliant extreme that people thought he had to be a little strange himself.
Poe invented detective fiction when he wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841.
Murders in the Rue Morgue really deserves to be called the first detective story. It started the whole tradition of detective fiction.
The Raven, which was published in 1845, was his huge breakthrough. It became a big bestseller.
Poe's career very much went up and down until he really hit The Raven, and that poem was known by, it seems everyone in the world. It had an enormous press.
On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died at the age of 40 under mysterious circumstances.
Poe's death may be one of the most bizarre things about his life. He left Virginia on his way to New York, disappeared. A week later, he was found on the streets of Baltimore.
We don't have a single piece of information about what he was doing. At the end of that week, he was found in a tavern, ill, drunk, and was taken to a hospital.
It turned out he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him, and a couple of days later, he died in a delirium. Nobody knows exactly what killed him. Edgar Allan Poe's legacy in American literature is very detectable in all of the mystery dramas and stories we have, and all the kind of horror and vampire work that we see, that there is that trace of the sort of horror and mystery that Poe really was able to harness in his writing.
Poe is an American icon. I think he's more than a writer.
Even today, more than 150 years after he died, everybody loves Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about The Telltale Heart. This was Edgar Allan Poe's short story. It's published in 1843 and basically surrounds the theme of murder and guilt and irony. This short story was considered Gothic fiction as it was published during the Romantic movement, which is also known as Romanticism. So here are words to know. Gothic fiction is a style of writing that has the following elements: fear, horror, it has the element of death and suspense and gloom. Gothic fiction also has romantic elements, such as the elements of nature and individuality and high emotion. Again, back to the suspense, real high emotion suspense. The Romantic movement is also known as Romanticism. And this was an artistic movement that began in the late 18th century and early 19th century that was characterized by nature and individual expression of emotion and imagination. One of famous books in time that was published during the Romantic movement is Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and it brings up all the scientific and about nature and just high emotion. So just an example of work that was published during that Romantic movement. I have also included here the text file of The Telltale Heart. That you can click onto this link and it'll bring you right to the text file for The Telltale Heart. There's also an audio file here of Telltale Heart that you could follow through and listen to. Now let's move on and talk a little bit about plot diagram. Okay, so plot diagram is used to help the reader organize the story into parts. By organizing the story into parts, it helps the reader analyze the story. So you're going to be reading The Telltale Heart, and in order for you to understand it and organize it, we're going to go through these 6 principal parts of a story. First, we're going to start with the exposition, which could also be called the introduction or the beginning of the story. So the exposition will ask, what information does the writer give you at the beginning of the story? It could be anything from setting and character, and then we move on to the rising action. The question that asks is, what event in the rising action drew you in most as a reader? And usually this is when it usually takes a number of steps for the rising action, and usually it's what draws you in most as a reader. Then we move on to the conflict. What types of conflict are present in the story? How did you identify them? So the conflict of the story is basically the problem. What is happening in the story? What is going on? And a good example of that is in Romeo and Juliet. Here's 2 families that are feuding, the Montagues and the Capulet, and basically that's the conflict in the story. The conflict in the story in that particular play is that these 2 families do not get along, thus Romeo and Juliet are stuck, and while they're in love, they can't be together because their families are feuding. So that would be an example of a conflict in a story. Then we move on to the climax. This is often considered the most exciting part or the most suspenseful part of the story. It's also the turning point of the story, basically the point of no return for the character, where things will never be the same for him or her. And now we move on to the falling action. In what way is the action in the story, this part of the story, different from the first part? The falling action is something that happens immediately after the climax that will lead into the resolution of the story. And then we move on to resolution. How does this part of the story make you feel? What else could the writer have done in this? The resolution is the outcome of the story. And so just to recap a little bit, these are literary terms that I want you to know. Exposition, this is the beginning or the introduction to a story. You will ask yourself while you're reading The Telltale Heart, who is the main character? What is the setting? You'll also ask regarding the rising action. This is usually where suspense builds and where the conflict of the story could be introduced. Normally these are several steps, and so you will gather those steps or several situations that occur. Then next would be the conflict. It's usually the struggle between two characters or forces. I gave you the Romeo and Juliet example. Then we have climax, which is the turning point in the story, and again, this is where things will never be the same for the character. Then we have the falling action. This is what happens immediately after the climax that leads to the resolution. Finally, we have the resolution, which is the outcome of the story, how things turned out for the character. And so with this lecture and video that you've watched and short story that you will read and or listen to, these are the assignments that we have to look forward to. You're going to be listening to the lecture on Edgar Allan Poe. You're going to be watching the mini biography on Edgar Allan Poe. You will familiarize yourself with all these literary terms that I have listed: Gothic fiction, romanticism, and the 6 principal parts of a plot diagram, and what they actually mean, and how to pull these parts out, and how to organize a story. Perhaps if you're going to write an essay, you would need to organize all these things. You're going to listen and read the Telltale Heart, and while you're listening and or reading the Telltale Heart, I want you to take notes as you interact. And this will be your assignment. You will take your notebook, you will write out the 6 principal elements of the plot diagram that we have gone over, and you will list parts of the story that correspond to that particular element. So you're going to write down exposition, which is the beginning of the story, and you're going to write what is the beginning of the story, what does the author tell us about the setting and about the main characters. You're going to move on to rising action, and then to conflict, and to climax, and so on and so forth. You're going to write all these elements down, and you're going to pull parts of the story. And then tomorrow, I need you to be prepared to share and collaborate in your study teams that we selected at the beginning of the semester. And you're going to sit with your teams. You're going to collaborate regarding this assignment, and you're going to talk about what parts you pulled out for what element in the plot diagram. You're going to gather them together, pick the 6 best ones, and you're going to create a storyboard as a team project, and you'll be graded separately for your writing assignment that you're going to be doing tonight, and you'll be graded separately as a team for your team project. If you have any questions, please see me, and I'll be happy to help you out with any questions that you may have. Okay, so this is where our lesson ends. Enjoy.